The howling of the wind had begun to make the branches of the trees in the depths of the forest rustle. The night sky was covered in thick clouds that concealed the stars. Mike had decided to go camping in this desolate forest. With his friends, however, the current weather was starting to make them uneasy. The group had set up their tents deep in the forest, and they gathered around the campfire. The unsettled weather had created a tense atmosphere among them. Mike turned to his friends by the fire and said, "Maybe we should tell some stories tonight." His girlfriend, Emma, hesitated for a moment but eventually agreed. "All right, I'll start. This story is related to a legend we heard when coming to camp here." Emma began the story years ago. The indigenous people who lived in this forest used to talk about a terrifying spirit that resided here. This spirit awakens in the darkest hours of the forest and hunts down anyone in its path. Once, a native who saw this spirit went insane with fear. Since then, people have avoided camping in this forest at night. While Mike and his friends listened intently, the silence of the forest had started to make them even more uneasy. Suddenly, from the depths of the forest, they heard a sound that was deep and eerie, like a moan. The group began to look at each other in alarm. "This must be just a sound made by the wind," Mike said. But there was an anxious look on his face. At that moment, the campfire suddenly went out. The group stared into the darkness in bewilderment, and a shadow began to rapidly approach from the forest. Emma's face turned pale, and she yelled, "Awakening in the dark!" The group hurriedly ran towards their tents, but the shadow followed them. Mike quickly zipped up the tent and jumped inside. His friends struggled in a panic to get inside their tents, but the shadow disappeared. Inside, the group sat huddled together, holding their breath. Outside, the forest fell silent. Then, for a long while, they heard nothing. By morning, the group decided to leave the forest in a hurry. They packed up their tents and headed towards their vehicles. However, Mike noticed a drop of blood flowing from his eye. When he touched it, he saw a cut. His clothes were stained with blood. "How did this happen?" he asked. His friends shook their heads in bewilderment. None of them remembered anything. Their memories of the night's events seemed to have been erased. As the group left the campsite, Mike's wound rapidly healed. But since they couldn't remember what had happened that night, they would never know. Was there truly a mysterious spirit awakening in the dark depths of the forest? Or was it just a trick of the wind? They might never find out. But after that day, they never set foot in that forest again. Darkness may hide mysteries and dangers. Perhaps some legends are turning into reality. Who knows? Maybe the awakening in the dark still waits deep within the forest. A few years had passed, and Mike and his friends had somewhat forgotten the memories of that terrifying night. However, the legend of the spirit that dwelled in the depths of the forest still lingered in their minds. One day, one of their friends expressed a desire for more adventure in the forest. They wanted to see the awakening in the dark that haunted the dark nights of the forest. The others were hesitant, but eventually, two of them decided to join the forest expedition. That night, they waited in the forest, starting a fire to keep them warm. As the night wore on, the wind increased, and the trees rustled. As time passed, tension grew among the group. An hour went by then too, but nothing happened. One of them started making jokes, saying, "Maybe they're awakening in." At that moment, the howling wind stopped, and a moan-like sound echoed from deep within the forest. Fear suddenly gripped them, and as they watched, a shadow rose from the forest. The shadows moved swiftly among the trees, growing closer and intensifying their fears. They saw the awakening in the dark. It was a terrifying entity beyond anything they could have imagined. This being, clad in a dark cloak, approached them with a malevolent grin, its eyes reflecting the coldness of death. One of the group members tried to run, but the awakening in the dark caught up with incredible speed, grabbing him and silencing him by strangling his throat. The others stood frozen with fear. Just as the legend had told, the awakening in the dark tortured and killed each of them one by one. By morning, the forest fell silent. The awakening in the dark had left the corpses of its victims in the forest and returned to its deep slumber. In the years that followed, The forest remained known as a dangerous and mysterious place. The memories of Mike and his friends had been erased, and the terror of that night was forgotten. However, this story continued to serve as a warning, reminding people of the hidden dangers within the forest. Who knows, perhaps the awakening in the dark would one day awaken again and seek new victim. The mysteries and dangers hidden deep within the forest might still be waiting to be discovered. The awakening in the dark story would always remind people of the dark secrets and unknown dangers lurking within the forest. While people may always be eager to explore the beauty of nature, sometimes they remain unaware of the darkness that lies behind that beauty. Once upon a time, in an old village, there was a place known as Witch's Hill, an eerie location that the villagers wouldn't even think of setting foot on, as terrifying stories surrounded the hill. However, none of these tales were frightening enough for a group of daring young friends who decided to, armed with torches, 5 close friends embarked on their journey to climb the steep slope of the hill. As they made their way, the weather suddenly grew colder, and even the hoot of the owls in the forest had ceased. When they reached the summit, they couldn't believe their eyes. There stood an old, decrepit house. Its windows were filled with broken glass, and its roof seemed to have collapsed. The friends decided to venture inside. The door swung open as if it had been waiting for them. As they explored the interior, they stumbled upon a room filled with diaries. When they started flipping through the pages, each page was filled with strange and eerie stories from past years. These stories depicted the bizarre experiences and encounters with ghosts that the former villagers had gone. The most captivating story was titled The Curse of Witch's Hill. According to the story, years ago, this hill used to be a gathering place for witches who had cast curses on the villagers, forcing them to abandon the village. The curse would be passed on to anyone who set foot on Witch's Hill. After reading this story, the friends shivered and decided to flee the house. However, on their way back, they noticed something had changed. The air had grown even colder, and the silence of the forest was shattered. They began to hear eerie sounds one after another. In fear, they started running, but every time they looked around, strange figures seemed to appear among the shadows. Finally, they reached Witch's Hill, but they couldn't enter the house, and they couldn't escape the things outside. The curse had. At that moment, they let out a scream and woke up. Each of them was in their beds, trembling from the horrifying experiences they had just dreamt. The events at Witch's Hill had not been real, yet they found it hard to forget that moment, and they vowed never to approach Witch's Hill again. Perhaps some ghost stories push the boundaries of reality and deeply affect people's fears. The friends, still under the influence of the horrifying experiences they had in their dreams, looked at each other and took deep breaths. They hadn't actually been to Witch's Hill, but the memories of the terrifying moments in their dreams still felt fresh. They each began to recount their dreams. One friend described the eerie shadows in the forest and the unnatural silence. Another talked about finding the diaries in the house and reading the stories within. The third one remembered being affected by the curse and the strange figures outside the house. Then one of them started to narrate the most frightening part. In their dreams, as they were trapped on Witch's Hill, they had let out a scream that had woken them all. But even in the waking world, the echo of that scream still lingered outside, just like it had in their dreams, huddled together. Though what they had shared were merely dreams, the fear they had experienced still hung heavily upon them. They all tried to make sense of what their dreams might mean. Perhaps the mysterious history of that hill and the forgotten ghosts of the village had left deep imprints in their subconscious. The friends concluded that, even though the events at Witch's Hill were not real, their dreams had left a lasting impact on them. They now approached their curiosity about that village and Witch's Hill with a sense of respect and a mixture of genuine fear. From that day forward, the friends never set foot on Witch's Hill again. Whether the stories were true or not was not important. They knew that this experience would affect them forever. And perhaps some fears could become a reality even in our dreams. From that day forward, the friends never set foot